Hey, everyone. Welcome back to Strange Mind 6. I'm your host, Ruby, and welcome back. Today, we are going to be reading more of Rebels and Revolution, True Stories, Real Tales of Radical Change in America, written by Judy Dodge Cummings. But before we begin, I would like to say if you guys can please give this video a thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe, hit that like button. It would mean a great deal to me if you did. And without further ado, my dear friends, grab a snack, grab a drink, or sit back and relax, and let's get to it. Chapter 4: A Cry for Justice. Jim Crow lurked everywhere in Montgomery, Alabama in the 1950s. You could see racism by drinking fountains and restrooms, in movie theaters and in schools, at restaurants and clothing stores. A teenager named Claudette Colvin grew up with Jim Crow, and she played by its rules year after year. One day, Claudette decided she'd had enough of Jim Crow. Her cry for justice launched a movement that transformed not just the American South, but the entire country. When Claudette was born in 1939 in Birmingham, Alabama, Jim Crow had ruled the state for decades. Jim Crow was not a person, but a way of life. Jump Jim Crow was a popular song after the Civil War that made fun of African American culture. The phrase Jim Crow became the label for the system of laws and social customs that treated African Americans as second-class citizens. Jim Crow laws kept African Americans segregated from whites. From birth to death, a line divided white and black people. This line was dangerous to cross. Black babies could not be born in white hospitals. Black children could not attend white schools. Blacks could not use white waiting rooms, restrooms, swimming pools, or parks. Jim Crow laws created a Jim Crow mindset. A white person called a black man boy, not sir or mister. A black person never shook a white person's hand, not because it implied equality. I'm sorry, let me read that sentence over. A black person never shook a white person's hand because it implied equality. In a vehicle, blacks were always made to sit behind whites, never beside or in front of them. Claudette did not notice Jim Crow much in the first years of her life because she lived in the tiny all-black community of Pine Level, about 30 miles from the state capital of Montgomery. Claudette was raised by her great-aunt and great-uncle, Mary Ann and Q.P. Colvin. She considered them her parents and called them Mom and Daddy Q.P. Claudette ran free through the neighborhood with her best friend Annie. They climbed trees and wandered trails and meandered in and out of the homes of their parents' many friends. School and church were the center of Claudette's life. She loved learning and was so good at it that she skipped second grade Claudette never missed church, especially Big Meeting Sunday. This one Sunday a month, Reverend H. H. Johnson came to preach, and the sermons, singing, eating, and games lasted from noon until dusk. In Pine Level, Jim Crow kept its distance, and Claudette grew up feeling self-confident and secure. When she turned 8, everything changed. The family moved to the big city of Montgomery, Alabama. The Colvins' new house was in the working-class neighborhood known as King Hill. Narrow houses lined unpaved streets, and an outhouse stood in each backyard. Daddy QP did yard work for a white man, and Mom was a maid for a white family. Jim Crow stalked Claudette throughout the city. When she went dress shopping, Jim Crow did not allow African Americans to try on clothes in the dressing room. If Claudette needed new shoes, Mom traced her bare feet on a brown paper bag and took the pattern to the store for the clerk to match. Jim Crow said no black feet could test shoes. A white person might buy later. That's ridiculous. Oak Park, the nicest park in Montgomery, was only a few blocks from Claudette's house, but Jim Crow ordered black folks never to play ball or rest on a bench there. But where Jim Crow irritated Claudette the most was on the city bus. Each bus had 36 seats. The first 4 rows were reserved for whites only. All riders, black and white, boarded the bus at the front door and deposited their fare in the coin box. Then, if any white person was on the bus, blacks had to get off and re-enter the bus by the rear door. Drivers constantly checked their rearview mirrors. If the white seats were full, a driver would order blacks to give up their seats to a white person. No African American could sit level to or ahead of a white rider. So, if 4 African Americans were sitting in a row and one white person needed a seat, all 4 blacks had to stand. Few African Americans owned cars, so they had to endure the daily humiliation of the buses to get to and from work and school. The Montgomery bus lines hired tough men, and city law gave them police-like powers. Some even carried guns. Bus drivers often referred to African American passengers as black cows and black apes. It was dangerous to resist. In 1952, a black man named Brooks was shot to death by police after he walked down the aisle past white people instead of using the rear door. The police officer was not charged because authorities said Brooks was resisting arrest, so it was justifiable homicide. In the fall of 1952, tragedy struck just as Claudette entered Booker T. Washington High School. Her little sister, Delphine, had contracted polio that summer, and she died in September, on Claudette's 14th birthday. A few weeks later, Jeremiah Reeves, a friend from Claudette's neighborhood, was arrested for raping a white woman. After a short trial by an all-white jury, Reeves was convicted and sentenced to die. The black community was convinced Reeves was innocent. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, was a national civil rights group with a local chapter in Montgomery. When members of the NAACP began to work on an appeal for Reeves, Claudette joined the cause. She attended rallies, wrote letters to Reeves in prison, and raised funds for his defense. Jeremiah Reeves, arrested. Jeremiah Reeves's arrest was the turning point of my life, Claudette later said. The U.S. Supreme Court threw out Reeves's conviction and ordered Alabama to retry him. Unfortunately, the boy's second run at justice was no better than the first. The jury took only 34 minutes to sentence him to death again. Anger filled Claudette. She was sick of being pushed around by white people. But she did not know what to do to change things. Then, two high school teachers helped Claudette channel her anger into action. Geraldine Nesbitt and Josie Lawrence were teachers at Booker T. Washington High School. Nesbitt taught English literature, and Lawrence taught history. These women did not follow the white school board's assigned lessons. Nesbitt taught the required writing of Edgar Allan Poe and Nathaniel Hawthorne, but her students also read the Magna Carta and U.S. Constitution. Reading these documents, Claudette began to mentally understand what she had always felt emotionally. Jim Crow was illegally depriving her of her rights as an American citizen. In history class, Josie Lawrence celebrated African heritage. She taught students that their culture did not begin on slave ships, but instead had a long and rich history on the African continent. Josie Lawrence was a very dark-skinned woman who proudly proclaimed that she was a pure-blooded African. The most popular girls in school were the ones with the lightest skin. Kids with dark skin, such as Claudette, were often called nappy-headed. Most girls spent hours with combs trying to straighten their kinky hair. They were trying to look white. By this time, change was in the air in schools across the South. In 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court had issued a landmark decision in Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. The court ruled that segregated schools were unconstitutional and they must integrate with all deliberate speed. In some communities, integration went smoothly, but in others, it was violent. Claudette had only 1 year left in high school and would finish it out at all-black Booker T. Washington. After that, she vowed to go to college and study law. Then she planned to return to Montgomery and work to defeat Jim Crow. In February 1955, Booker T. Washington High School celebrated Negro History Week. Nesbitt and Lawrence turned it into Negro History Month. Claudette soaked up lessons about African history and culture and about black heroes and celebrities. Every day she left school fired up to take a stand. She was tired of worrying about whether her skin was too dark or her hair too curly. She was tired of listening to adults complain about inequality, but not act to change things. I was tired of hoping for justice, Claudette remembered. When my moment came, I was ready. Her moment came on March 2nd, 1955. That muggy spring afternoon, Claudette walked to the bus stop with her friends after school. The yellow and green city bus pulled up, and Claudette climbed on board. She dropped her fare in the coin box, and because there were no whites on the bus, Claudette and her friends proceeded down the aisle. Claudette chose a seat in the middle of the bus. One of her friends sat beside her, and two other classmates sat in the row directly across the aisle. Claudette stacked her textbooks neatly in her lap and stared out the window. The bus stopped at every corner. More and more people got on. The rows reserved for whites filled up quickly. Suddenly, Claudette glanced up. A white woman was standing in the aisle waiting for Claudette and the other 3 students to give up their seat. The bus driver looked in the rearview mirrors. "I need those seats." Claudette studied the white woman. She was not old or sick or pregnant. She did not deserve a seat more than Claudette. They had paid the same fare. But Jim Crow was not about fairness. It was about white superiority. Claudette's friends stood up and went to the back of the bus. The white woman now had 3 empty seats to choose from. But she would not sit down because Claudette, a black girl, would be sitting beside her, not behind her. All the brave black women Claudette had studied in history class that month ran through her mind. They had stood up for justice. Now it was her turn. Years later, Claudette said, "I could not move because history had me glued to the seat. It felt like Sojourner Truth's hands were pushing me down on one shoulder and Harriet Tubman's hands were pushing me down on another shoulder." "Why are you still sitting there?" the driver yelled. Claudette did not move or reply. The driver scolded in the rearview mirror. "Get up, girl." Claudette stared straight ahead. She could feel outrage radiating off the white woman standing in the aisle. But the bus driver drove a few more blocks and then pulled over behind a squad car. A tense silence fell over the bus. Claudette swallowed and tried to slow down her racing heart as she watched 2 policemen enter the bus. "Who is it?" an officer asked. The driver pointed at Claudette. Both officers walked down the aisle and loomed over her. "Aren't you going to get up?" the officer asked. "No, sir," she replied. "Get up," he shouted. Claudette began to cry. "It's my constitutional right to sit here as much as that lady paid." Nerves made her voice high-pitched. "I paid my fare. It's my constitutional right." Each officer grabbed one of Claudette's arms and yanked her up. Her textbooks flew to the ground. Claudette knew better than to struggle, so she went limp. One of the officers kicked her and they dragged her off the bus. "It's my constitutional right," Claudette repeated as they shoved her into the back of the squad car. Through her tears, Claudette saw blurry black and white faces peering at her through the bus window. The ride to the police station was torture. The policemen taunted her. They made rude comments about her body. Claudette put her handcuffed hands together and prayed. Although Claudette was only 15, she was taken to the city jail, where adult criminals were held. An officer led Claudette to a cell, pushed her in, and slammed the door. When the guard turned the key in the lock, Claudette said, "It was the worst sound I ever heard. It said I was trapped." She fell on her knees and prayed like I'd never prayed before. Old Jim Crow had won this round. Claudette's jail stay was short, but her upcoming battle would be long and grueling. Her mother and Reverend H. H. Johnson bailed her out. On the ride home, the Reverend told Claudette he was proud of her. Everyone prays for freedom, but you're different. I think you just brought the revolution to Montgomery. The black community agreed. Claudette returned home to a jubilant home. Word of her braver stand spread throughout King Hill. People gathered at the Colvin house. Everyone hugged and praised Claudette. Claudette was warmed by all the positive attention, but terrified of her upcoming trial. Fred Gray was one of Montgomery's two African American attorneys. He had long wanted to mount a legal challenge to Jim Crow, and he agreed to represent Claudette. A group of black leaders met with the police commissioner and the manager of the bus company. Among these leaders were 26-year-old Martin Luther King Jr., the new pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. The meeting was cordial, and the bus company admitted that Claudette had not been sitting in a white-only seat. She technically had not broken the law, but the police commissioner refused to drop the charges. Claudette would go to trial. Gray went to the Colvin house to make sure Claudette and her family knew the danger they faced. Claudette was tackling Jim Crow head-on. The Ku Klux Klan, a white supremacist terrorist group, had lynched people for less. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Gray asked. "Yes, I am," Claudette answered. On March 18th, Claudette's case was heard in juvenile court in front of Judge Willie Hill. Claudette faced 3 charges: breaking the segregation law, disturbing the peace, and assaulting the police officers. The police officers testified that Claudette had kicked and hit them as they tried to peacefully remove her from the bus. They read a letter from a white passenger who described the policemen as gentle and said they spoke so quietly that other passengers could not even hear them. 13 black students who had been on the bus also attended the hearing. Their testimony contradicted the police, as the students described how the officers yelled at Claudette and kicked her before dragging her off the bus. Fred Gray argued that Jim Crow violated the protections every citizen of the United States was given by the Constitution, but this defense was useless. Judge Hill issued a quick and harsh verdict. Claudette was guilty on all charges. She was placed on probation, made a ward of the state, and released to the custody of Mom and Daddy QP. The judge banged the gavel. Court dismissed. Despair washed over Claudette, and she began to weep. She was a convicted criminal, just because she had not given up her seat to a white person. And in all honesty, the way we're going now, that's exactly where we're going to be freaking going. It's going to get like that all over again. Sorry about that, I needed some water. Despite her disappointment in the verdict, Claudette was not ready to give up her fight for justice. She waited as the civil rights leaders struggled with what reaction they should take to the verdict. One option was to boycott the city buses. 3/4 of the riders were black. If African Americans stayed off the buses, the city transportation system would go broke. But the black community was worried. If they launched a boycott now, Claudette would be the face of the movement. She was only 15. Some of the adults questioned whether a rebellious teenager would follow their guidance. Plus, the Colvins came from a different social class than the city's civil rights leaders. Her great aunt and great uncle, Mary Ann and QP, had dropped out of school after the sixth grade. They both performed manual labor for whites. The family lived in King Hill, a neighborhood with a rough reputation. Claudette was described as too emotional and feisty. The civil rights leaders decided to wait for a better role model to inspire a bus boycott. Leaders helped her raise money to appeal her case, and then they left her alone. On May 6, 1955, Fred Gray went to court to appeal Claudette's conviction. This time, a different judge heard the case, and he dropped 2 charges. Now, she was only guilty of assaulting the police officers, but she still had a criminal record. Claudette's rebellion had gotten her nothing but trouble, and Jim Crow was still alive and well on Montgomery's bus. When she returned to school for the last weeks of her junior year, Claudette was no longer the brave rebel. Attitudes had hardened against her. Students saw her as a troublemaker and mocked her with a sing-song chant, "It's my constitutional right, it's my constitutional right." Claudette was isolated and lonely, but found a way to fight back. She gave up straightening her hair and braided it into cornrows. Everyone was stunned the day Claudette walked into school with a head full of braids. She was ridiculed, but she held her chin high and told everyone, "I won't straighten my hair until they, the government, straighten out this mess." Summer vacation had arrived. Since Claudette was afraid to go to dances or parties with other teenagers, in case she might accidentally violate her probation, she spent hours alone. Soon, Claudette found herself in an even bigger mess. Church and NAACP youth group meetings were her 2 social outlets. The youth group meetings were led by Rosa Parks, a middle-aged seamstress and civil rights activist. Claudette liked Parks, who was an intelligent, kind woman, but she felt uncomfortable with the other kids at the meeting. They were the children of educated professionals who attended private high schools. Gradually, Claudette stopped going to youth group meetings. She felt more isolated than ever. One day, Claudette met someone who made her feel less lonely. She watched a ball game at King Hill Park when a man struck up a conversation with her. He was in his mid-20s and married, but was separated from his wife. The man told Claudette to ignore the people who teased her for wearing braids. He complimented her on standing up for what she believed in. Claudette knew she was in dangerous territory hanging out with a much older married man, but he made her feel good about herself again. She kept on seeing him. When summer ended and her senior year began, Claudette was pregnant. Shortly before Christmas, the principal called her to his office. Claudette had expected this. "I know why I'm here," she told him. "You don't need to say it." The principal said it anyways. A semester short of graduation and Claudette's education was over. She'd been expelled. Everyone turned their backs on her, friends, teachers, and civil rights activists. Then, just as Claudette went into exile, the spark she had lit on a bus one afternoon finally burst into flames. But all Claudette could do was watched from the sidelines. On December 2nd, 1955, Rosa Parks refused a bus driver's command to give up her seat for a white person. That weekend, activists distributed tens of thousands of leaflets in factories and stores, in restaurants and beauty parlors, in church pews, and on street corners. The leaflet told of the arrest of Rosa Parks and urged every Negro to stay off the bus Monday in protest of the arrest and trial. In the light-skinned, soft-spoken, respectable Rosa Parks, the civil rights leader had found the face to launch the movement that Claudette had begun. The black community responded, and on Monday, December 5th, the buses ran empty. That evening, a mass rally was held at a black church. Nearly 1,000 people wedged into the pews, and thousands more gathered on the street outside. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke just that day. He had been elected leader of a new civil rights group, the Montgomery Improvement Association, MIA. This was King's first public speech outside of his sermons. He promised that blacks in Montgomery would fight until justice runs down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. A vote was held on whether to continue the boycott until Jim Crow was kicked off Montgomery buses. The verdict was unanimous. Stay off the buses until black people could sit where they wanted. When Claudette heard that Rosa Parks had been arrested and a boycott was launched, she was glad an adult had finally taken a stand. But she had done exactly the same thing that Parks did almost a year earlier. Although Claudette had great respect for Rosa Parks, being forgotten and excluded really, really hurt. The city of Montgomery dug in its heels and the boycott continued. Blacks who owned cars donated them for use in community car pools. For more than 40 pickup stations sprang up around the city where volunteers drove people to and from work. Thousands of people walked. By late January of 1956, the bus company was losing $3,200 a day. The police cracked down on protesters. They arrested Martin Luther King Jr. for driving 5 miles over the speed limit, and he spent a night in jail. 2 officers threw acid on another civil rights leader's car as it sat parked beside her house, and then fled in their squad car. As the boycott continued, Claudette wanted to be a part of the movement. I'd had justice on my mind for a long time. Being pregnant did not change her passion for equality. Church rallies were held 2 nights a week to keep people's spirit up. Embarrassed by her pregnancy, Claudette attended rallies at churches outside her neighborhood, so she did not run into people she knew. Although she could not play much of a role, she wanted to help keep the boycott going. One morning, Fred Gray knocked on the Colvins' front door. Claudette had not heard a word from him since her appeal. Gray was there on serious business. Since the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled that segregated schools were unconstitutional, then segregated buses must be too. The NAACP was mounting a legal challenge in federal court. Instead of fighting for one rider at a time, the organization was filing a case action suit on behalf of all black bus riders. Gray needed plaintiffs. These people would testify in court about the harm Jim Crow buses had caused them. Gray needed brave people who could stand up to the white power structure. Gray had 4 other women, but he really wanted Claudette to join the lawsuit. As Claudette listened, 2 thoughts struck her. The Ku Klux Klan would resist this lawsuit with every weapon of terror at its disposal. Her blood ran cold as she imagined men in white hoods coming to King Hill at night. But another thought ran on the heels of this image. She did not want to live in fear. "Yes, I'll join the suit," she told Fred Gray. Claudette gave birth to a baby boy on March 29, 1956. While she learned how to be a new mother, she also prepared for her day in court. On May 11, 1956, Claudette rose early and dressed with care. Daddy QP accompanied Claudette to the courthouse. A crowd of people, mostly African Americans, was gathered on the sidewalk. The men wore suits, and the women dressed in their Sunday's best. Reporters and cameramen milled about it. The courthouse doors opened and everyone filed inside. Claudette and the other plaintiffs sat beside their legal team on the right side of the chamber. The city attorney and defense witnesses were seated on the left. The 3-judge panel sat in high-backed chairs at the front of the chamber, flanked by flags of the United States and Alabama. Spectators filed and filled the main floor and balcony. One by one, the plaintiffs testified to how they had been mistreated on Montgomery's buses. The strategy of the city's attorney was to cast the boycotters as puppets of Dr. King, who had not minded the segregated buses until he came along and stirred things up. Claudette was scheduled to testify last. A knot tightened in her stomach as she waited for her turn. "Call your next witness," the judge ordered. "I call Claudette Colvin," Gray said. Claudette stood ramrod straight as she swore to tell the truth. A sea of black faces lay before her. In the back of the courtroom, one of her neighbors gave her a thumbs up. Gray took Claudette step by step through the events of March 2, 1955. Then, it was the city attorney's turn. Time and again, he tried to trick Claudette into painting Dr. King as the mastermind of the boycott. "Did you have a leader?" the attorney demanded. "Our leaders is just we, ourselves," she replied. Claudette carefully judged the attorney's tricky questions. She knew Dr. King had not put her up to anything. She had challenged the Jim Crow bus system because she was sick of being treated like a second-class citizens. "Why did you, Negroes, stop riding the bus on December 5th? The attorney asked. "Because we were treated wrong, dirty and nasty." Claudette's gaze was steady and her voice strong. The city attorney gave up. No further questions. It took the judges only 10 minutes to reach a decision, but they waited more than a month until June 19th to announce it. In Browder v. Gale, the court ruled for the plaintiffs. The court found the Montgomery bus system unconstitutional. City officials immediately appealed the decision to the U.S. Supreme Court, so the bus boycott continued. Finally, on November 13, 1956, the news was announced. The Supreme Court had affirmed the lower court's decision. On December 20th, two federal marshals served Montgomery with orders to immediately integrate the buses. After 381 days, Montgomery's bus boycott was over. The next morning, Dr. King and several other activists boarded a bus, dropped their fare in the coin box, and took seats in the front row. Claudette Colvin was not among them, a single mother struggling to make ends meet. Claudette watched the nation embrace Rosa Parks as the hero who launched the Montgomery bus boycott. The girl whose bravery started the revolution faded into the shadows, just a footnote in history. Claudette eventually earned her GED, equivalent to a high school diploma. She had another child, became a nurse's aide, and settled in New York City. She assumed her role in desegregating Montgomery buses had been long ago forgotten. She was wrong. On the 50th anniversary of the bus boycott, Claudette was invited to speak to the student body of Booker T. Washington High School. The experience thrilled her. It was 5 decades later, but she was finally receiving recognition as a fighter for justice. When the students asked Claudette what advice she had for them, she said, "Don't give up. Keep struggling." Claudette came to understand that Rosa Parks was the right person to represent the civil rights movement at its birth. But Claudette also knew that she had carried an important message too. "Mine was the first cry for justice," she recalled, "and a loud one." And that is the end of chapter 4, my dear friends. If you have any questions, any comments, please leave the comments down below. I would greatly appreciate it, and I will answer as much as I possibly can and get to your comments one by one. As always, my dear friends, may you have a wonderful morning, afternoon, or night whenever this video reaches you. This has been Ruby, signing off.